Detective Amos Brandt pushed through the crowd of uniformed officers, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene. The air reeked of blood and burnt flesh, a nauseating combination that turned his stomach. He steeled himself, focusing on the task at hand. Splicing had always been a part of life in New Citadel. But this was something else entirely. The alleyway was a grisly tableau of mangled bodies and viscera, the victims' remains barely recognizable as human. Brandt's eyes narrowed as he took in the claw marks that tore through fabric and flesh alike, the bite wounds that suggested an animal attack. But it was the twisted, grotesque limbs that truly chilled him, an unmistakable sign of illegal splicing. As he approached the first body, Brandt felt a familiar anger simmering beneath the surface. These people were victims not only of a brutal attack, but of a system that allowed the rich and powerful to play God with human lives. He swore under his breath, vowing to bring those responsible to justice. "What do we know so far?" he barked, turning to the young officer who stood nearby, clipboard in hand. "Not much, sir," the officer stammered, taken aback by Brandt's intensity. "Witnesses reported hearing screams around 2 a.m. When we arrived, we found this." He gestured helplessly at the carnage surrounding them. Brandt nodded curtly, his mind already racing with questions. Who was behind this? And why? He knew all too well the dark world of black market splicing, the desperate men and women who would do anything for a chance at power or perfection. But this was different. These mutations were unlike anything he'd ever seen, a twisted mockery of nature's design. He began to methodically search the area, his keen eyes scanning for any clue that might lead him to the perpetrator. As he moved from body to body, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. There was something almost feral about the way they'd been torn apart, as if their attacker had reveled in their suffering. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a woman's voice, trembling with fear. I saw him," she whispered, her eyes wide and haunted. "The monster that did this." Brandt turned to face her, his expression softening slightly. "Tell me what you saw," he said gently, guiding her to a relatively clean spot on the pavement. The woman took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes darting between Brandt and the carnage behind him. He wasn't human," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "At least not anymore. He had claws and teeth like a wolf's, and his eyes, they glowed like embers in the dark." A cold knot formed in Brandt's stomach as he listened to her words. He'd heard rumors of such creatures, the results of illegal experiments and unchecked splicing. But until now, he'd never encountered one himself. "Thank you," he said, squeezing the woman's hand reassuringly. "You've been very helpful." As he watched her disappear into the crowd, Brandt's resolve hardened. He would find the monster responsible for this, and he would bring it to justice, no matter the cost. Turning back to the crime scene, he began issuing orders to the officers around him, his voice firm and commanding. "I want this entire area searched inch by inch. Gather any evidence you can find, and interview every witness you can track down. I want to know who these people were, and who might have wanted them dead." As the officers scrambled to comply, Brandt surveyed the scene one last time, his eyes lingering on the twisted, broken bodies. He knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger. But he also knew that he wouldn't rest until the truth was uncovered, and those responsible were brought to justice, for the sake of the victims, and for the future of New Citadel itself. Amos Brandt's boots echoed on the sterile linoleum floor of the research facility, the only sound in the otherwise silent building. He had arranged a clandestine meeting with Dr. Marcus Whitaker, who waited for him in his office, the door slightly ajar. As Brandt approached, he saw the doctor sitting behind a cluttered desk, his eyes fixed on a report in front of him. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the floor. Upon noticing Brandt, Whitaker looked up and gestured for him to enter. "Detective Brandt, thank you for coming," he said, his measured tone betraying a hint of apprehension. "Dr. Whitaker," Brandt responded, closing the door behind him. "I appreciate your willingness to speak with me about this matter." The doctor leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I must admit, I've grown increasingly concerned about the state of genetic experimentation in this city. The ethical implications. They're troubling, to say the least. Brant nodded, his gaze locked onto Whitaker's sharp eyes. That's why I'm here. I need your help to uncover the truth about these black market splicing labs. Whitaker sighed, rubbing his temples. Very well. I've managed to gather some information that may be of use to you. There are a number of underground establishments catering to those seeking illegal enhancements. One in particular has been linked to several incidents involving unstable splices. He handed Brant a slip of paper with an address scribbled on it. Be cautious, detective. These places are dangerous, and those who frequent them are often desperate or ruthless. I'll keep that in mind, Brant replied, pocketing the address. Thank you, Dr. Whitaker. Your cooperation is invaluable. As Brant left the facility, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. The city he'd sworn to protect was spiraling into chaos, and the line between right and wrong was becoming increasingly blurred. The seedy establishment was nestled in the heart of New Citadel's underbelly, a dingy bar that catered to the desperate and the depraved. Brant had donned a worn leather jacket and a pair of tinted glasses, hoping to blend in with the crowd. The stench of alcohol and sweat hung heavy in the air, and the low murmur of conversation was punctuated by the occasional raucous laugh or shout. Brant scanned the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He spotted a man in the corner, his face obscured by a hoodie, who seemed to be watching the crowd with a predatory gaze. Sensing an opportunity, Brant made his way over, sliding onto the stool next to him. What'll it be? The bartender asked, not bothering to hide his disdain. Whiskey. Neat, Brant replied, keeping his eyes on the hooded figure. As the drink was set in front of him, Brant turned to the man, his voice low and steady. I'm looking for someone. Heard you might know where to find them. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Brant thought he'd made a mistake. But then, the stranger leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. What's it worth to you? Brant reached into his pocket, pulling out a small wad of cash. This should be enough to get us started. The man glanced at the money, then back at Brant, a sly smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Follow me. As he trailed the man through the crowded bar, Brant couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping up his spine. He knew that he was venturing into dangerous territory, but the thought of bringing justice to the victims of these heinous crimes drove him forward. He was led to a back room, the air thick with the smell of chemicals and the distant hum of machinery. Brant's heart raced as he took in the scene before him. Rows of cages filled with grotesque creatures, their bodies twisted and contorted by the cruel hand of genetic manipulation. A woman in a lab coat approached them, her eyes cold and calculating. What do you want? She demanded, her voice devoid of emotion. Brant fought to keep his composure, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. I'm looking for information on the organization responsible for this, he said, his voice barely above a growl. The woman sneered, her lip curling in disgust. You're in no position to make demands, but perhaps we can come to an arrangement. As she spoke, one of the creatures in the cages let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes fixed on Brant with a primal hunger. He knew that he was walking a razor's edge, teetering on the brink of discovery and disaster. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. Taking a deep breath, Brant steeled himself, preparing for the battle that lay ahead. He would stop at nothing to bring those responsible to justice, even if it meant descending into the darkest depths of human depravity. For the sake of the victims, and for the future of New Citadel itself. Amos Brant stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, as the creature before him snarled and thrashed against its restraints. Its skin was a mottled patchwork of fur and human flesh, its eyes burning with an otherworldly rage. He had seen horrors before, but nothing compared to the monstrosity that now loomed over him. The lab had seemed like any other on the surface, a grimy, run-down building nestled in the bowels of New Citadel. But as Brant and his team had stormed the premises, they had found themselves face to face with a nightmare born of twisted science and unchecked ambition. Detective Brant! A voice cut through the din, pulling him back to reality. It was Sergeant Remy Thorne, her sharp eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. We need to move. There could be more of these Things. Brant nodded, his gaze locked on the hybrid's contorted face. He could see the humanity beneath the monstrous exterior, the flicker of pain and fear that spoke to the atrocities it had endured. It was a grim reminder of the price of unchecked genetic splicing, and the toll it took on both the innocent and the guilty. As they made their way through the lab, Brant couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He could sense the presence of someone else, someone who knew more about the twisted experiments than anyone else. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. "Nina," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to find Dr. Rhodes. She's the key to all of this." Nina Santos, a resourceful journalist with a knack for uncovering the truth, nodded grimly. Her eyes were steeled with determination, her fingers itching to expose the darkness that lay at the heart of the city. She knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but she was willing to risk everything to bring the perpetrators to justice. Together, the unlikely trio pressed on, determined to uncover the truth and put an end to the nightmare that had consumed New Citadel. But as they delved deeper into the world of black market splicing, they would find that the horrors they had seen were only the beginning. As they navigated the dark, claustrophobic corridors of the lab, Brant found himself reflecting on the choices that had led him here. He had always known that the world of genetic enhancement was fraught with danger, but he had never imagined the true depths of depravity that it could reach. He thought back to his own splicing, the subtle alterations that had granted him the grace and agility of a predator. It had been a choice born of necessity, a means to protect the citizens of New Citadel from the threats that lurked in the shadows. But now, as he stared into the eyes of the monster before him, he couldn't help but wonder if he had become part of the very problem he sought to solve. "Focus, Amos," Remy's voice cut through his thoughts, her sharp gaze fixed on the path ahead. "We'll deal with the consequences later. Right now, we need to find Rhodes and put an end to this." Brant nodded, forcing his doubts aside as they pressed onward. He knew that Remy was right. There would be time for reflection and redemption, but only if they could stop the twisted machinations of Dr. Rhodes and her ilk. As they rounded a corner, they found themselves face to face with a sight that would haunt their dreams for years to come. A massive, hulking figure stood before them, its body a grotesque amalgamation of human and animal DNA. Its muscles rippled with raw, unchecked power, its eyes burning with a primal hunger that sent chills down their spines. "This is it," Brant whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. "The key to Rhodes's operation. We need to take it down." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, that the true horrors of Dr. Rhodes's work were still waiting to be unleashed. As the hybrid lunged towards them, its massive jaws snapping and snarling, Brant knew that they had crossed the point of no return. There would be no turning back, no second chances. They would either stop Dr. Rhodes and her twisted creations, or be consumed by the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. And so, with grim determination, they steeled themselves for the battle that lay ahead, their fates intertwined in a desperate struggle to reclaim the soul of New Citadel. Amos Brant stood in the dimly lit room, his eyes scanning the grotesque tableau before him. Tubes and wires snaked across the floor, connecting to tanks filled with a murky, pulsating liquid. Inside each tank, a human form floated, their bodies twisted and distorted by the cruel machinations of splicing. He could barely suppress the bile rising in his throat. "Jesus Christ," Nina muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of monster would do this?" Remy's sharp gaze darted around the room, his enhanced vision piercing the shadows. "We need to find any information we can on Rhodes's operation. There has to be something here." As they combed through the lab, Amos felt a growing sense of unease. The sheer scope of Rhodes's experiments was staggering, and the thought of what she might be capable of sent chills down his spine. Suddenly, Nina gasped, her hand trembling as she held up a data drive. "I think I found something. It's labeled Lila Rhodes." Amos took the drive, his heart racing as he plugged it into a nearby console. The screen flickered to life, revealing a series of genetic sequences and schematics. His eyes widened in horror as he realized what he was looking at. This is Lila's splice," he choked out. "Rhodes combined human DNA with that of a predator, creating the perfect killing machine. The implications weighed heavily on them all, the gravity of their situation settling like a leaden shroud. They had to stop Rhodes before she unleashed her monstrous creations on an unsuspecting world. Just as they were about to leave, a sudden, strangled cry echoed through the lab. They turned to see Dr. Marcus Whitaker slumped against a wall, his face ashen. "Whitaker, what's wrong?" Amos demanded, rushing to his side. The geneticist's voice was barely audible as he confessed, I told Rhodes about your investigation. I never thought she would. I'm so sorry." Before they could react, the sound of shattering glass filled the air, followed by the unmistakable growl of one of Rhodes's hybrids. It lunged at them, its powerful claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. As Amos and Remy fought to hold the creature at bay, Nina frantically searched for an escape route. They were trapped in the very heart of Rhodes's twisted domain, and the thought of being consumed by her monstrous creations filled them with dread. With a Herculean effort, they managed to fend off the hybrid long enough to make their escape, but not before it had left a trail of carnage in its wake. As they emerged from the lab, battered and bruised, they knew that their battle against Rhodes was far from over. The darkness that had once seemed so distant now loomed over them, threatening to consume everything they held dear. And as they gazed out upon the city they had sworn to protect, they vowed to bring Rhodes to justice, no matter the cost. The stench of singed flesh and shattered glass hung heavy in the air as Detective Amos Brandt led his team through the remnants of Dr. Rhodes's ravaged lab. The sight of twisted metal and mangled equipment served as a chilling reminder of the depths to which Rhodes would sink in her pursuit of unchecked power. Nina Santos, her face streaked with grime and determination, spoke first. "We can't let her get away with this, Amos. We need to shut down the black market splicing trade and bring her to justice." Remy Thorne, his eagle-enhanced eyes scanning the wreckage, nodded in agreement. "It's time to end this nightmare before more innocent lives are destroyed." Brandt's jaw clenched as he surveyed the carnage around them. He couldn't shake the image of Lila's tortured expression, a haunting testament to the horrors her mother had inflicted upon her. His voice was steeled with resolve. "We'll infiltrate Rhodes's main lab and capture her, but we need to be prepared for anything. God knows what other monstrosities she's created." The team huddled together, their faces etched with a mix of anger and determination. As they plotted their next move, the weight of their task hung heavy upon them. They knew that the fate of New Citadel rested on their shoulders, and they would stop at nothing to save it from Rhodes's twisted machinations. As they delved deeper into the underbelly of the city, the tension grew palpable. The streets seemed to whisper with the echoes of untold horrors, and the shadows seemed to dance with sinister intent. In the distance, the faint sound of howling and snarling could be heard, a chilling reminder of the rogue hybrid that continued its rampage across the city. With each step they took, the team encountered more of Rhodes's creations. They fought tooth and nail, their every muscle straining with the effort to hold back the tide of abominations that threatened to consume them. As they clashed with the hybrids, Brandt couldn't help but wonder how many more innocent lives had been twisted and warped by Rhodes's insatiable ambition. As they inched closer to Rhodes's main lab, the scope of her experiments became increasingly apparent. They stumbled upon hidden chambers filled with grotesque specimens, their bodies a patchwork of stitches and sutures. The sight of these tortured souls sent a shiver down Brandt's spine, and he vowed to put an end to Rhodes's reign of terror once and for all. The final confrontation with Rhodes loomed on the horizon, a storm cloud gathering in the distance. But as they pressed on, the team knew that they would face their greatest challenge yet. With the rogue hybrid still at large, and the city teetering on the brink of chaos, they would need to summon every ounce of courage and cunning to emerge victorious from the darkness that threatened to consume them all. But for now, they pushed forward, their resolve unwavering in the face of the unimaginable horrors that awaited them. They would not rest until Rhodes was brought to justice, and the black market splicing trade was eradicated once and for all. For the sake of New Citadel and the countless lives that hung in the balance, they would stop at nothing to restore order to a world gone mad. Amos Brandt stood frozen, his eyes locked on the holographic display that revealed the truth he had long feared. The image of Lila Rhodes, her DNA strands twisted and interwoven with the genetic code of multiple predators, left him with a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. As the team exchanged worried glances, the gravity of the situation settled upon them like a suffocating fog. "She's the deadliest hybrid of them all," Dr. Marcus Whitaker whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and horror. "Her genetic makeup is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's a miracle she's even alive, let alone capable of the carnage she's inflicted." Brant's mind raced as he tried to piece together the implications of this revelation. Lila's ruthless determination, combined with her monstrous abilities, had already pushed the city to the brink of chaos. If they didn't act quickly, there would be no stopping her or the rogue hybrid that continued to wreak havoc in the streets. As if on cue, an urgent message crackled through the comms, a panicked voice reporting yet another gruesome attack. Brant clenched his fists, his resolve hardening like steel. He couldn't afford to let the weight of responsibility crush him now. The city needed him to be strong, to be the hero they so desperately needed. "We don't have much time," he growled, his voice barely concealing the turmoil within. "We need to find Lila and the rogue hybrid before it's too late. I won't let them destroy everything we've fought to protect." The team nodded in grim determination, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resolve. They knew the odds were stacked against them, but they refused to back down. They were New Citadel's last hope, and they would not falter in their duty. With a final nod from Brant, the team sprang into action, their movements swift and precise. They scoured the city, following the trail of destruction left by the hybrids, their every step fraught with danger. Each new report of slaughter served only to fuel their desperation, pushing them to the very limits of their endurance. As they closed in on their quarry, the stakes grew higher with each passing moment. The city teetered on the edge of an abyss, the darkness threatening to consume them all. It was now or never. They had to act quickly and decisively to save New Citadel from the clutches of chaos. With a deep breath, Amos Brant prepared himself for the battle that lay ahead. He knew that the road would be long and fraught with danger, but he would not waver. He would do whatever it took to protect the city he loved and stop the monsters that threatened to tear it apart. As the team converged on the last known location of the hybrids, the tension in the air was palpable. They knew that they were walking into the heart of darkness, but they refused to be cowed by fear. They would face their enemies head-on, their courage unwavering in the face of unimaginable horrors. Together, they would stand against the tide of chaos and fight to restore order to a world gone mad. Together, they would save New Citadel from the clutches of the monstrous hybrids and the twisted machinations of Dr. Evelyn Rhodes. And together, they would bring an end to the nightmare that had consumed their city. But first, they had to survive the final confrontation that loomed before them. They had to face the deadliest hybrid of all and put an end to her reign of terror once and for all. And as they steeled themselves for the battle that lay ahead, they knew that there was no turning back. They were locked in a desperate struggle for the fate of New Citadel, and they would not rest until victory was theirs. In this darkest of hours, Amos Brant and his team would fight to the bitter end, their determination unyielding in the face of overwhelming odds. They would not falter, they would not fail. They were the last hope of New Citadel, and they would not go quietly into the night. For the sake of the city they loved, they would stand against the darkness and fight to the very end. And as the final battle began, they knew that they were ready. They were united, they were strong, and they were determined to save New Citadel from the clutches of chaos. The endgame had begun, and there was no turning back. It was time to face the monsters that lurked in the shadows and bring an end to the nightmare that had consumed their city. It was time to take a stand and fight for the future of New Citadel. And as Amos Brant and his team charged into battle, their hearts filled with courage and determination, they knew that they would not go down without a fight. They would stand against the darkness and fight to the very end. For the sake of New Citadel, they would give everything they had to protect the city they loved. And as the final battle raged on, they knew that they were ready. They were united, they were strong, and they were determined to save New Citadel from the clutches of chaos. It was time to face the monsters that lurked in the shadows and bring an end to the nightmare that had consumed their city. The endgame had begun, and there was no turning back. It was time to take a stand and fight for the future of New Citadel. And as Amos Brant and his team charged into battle, their hearts filled with courage and determination, they knew that they would not go down without a fight. They would stand against the darkness and fight to the very end. For the sake of New Citadel, they would give everything they had to protect the city they loved. And as the final battle raged on, they knew that they were ready. They were united, they were strong, and they were determined to save New Citadel from the clutches of chaos. It was time to face the monsters that lurked in the shadows and bring an end to the nightmare that had consumed their city. The endgame had begun, and there was no turning back. It was time to take a stand and fight for the future of New Citadel. And as am. The taste of copper filled Amos Brant's mouth as he cradled the limp body of Sergeant Remy Thorne, his lifelong friend and ally. Blood seeped from the gaping wound in Thorne's chest, pooling around them on the cold, hard pavement. Thorne's spliced eagle genes, once a symbol of his strength and agility, now seemed a cruel mockery in the face of death. No, not like this, Brant choked out, his voice thick with grief. The rogue hybrid, a grotesque amalgamation of bear, wolf, and human DNA, stood over them, its chest heaving with exertion. Its eyes, burning with an unsettling intelligence mixed with primal rage, seemed to gloat over its latest kill. As the hybrid turned to disappear into the shadows, Brant's feline grace and agility kicked in. He lunged forward, grabbing the creature by its fur-covered arm. "You will pay for this!" he snarled, his intense blue eyes locked onto the beast's monstrous face. But the hybrid was too strong, easily shaking off Brant's grip before vanishing into the night. Brant collapsed next to Thorne's body, the weight of their mission crashing down upon him. As he stared at his friend's lifeless eyes, the enormity of their task became painfully clear. The consequences of unchecked genetic splicing had never been more apparent, and Brant couldn't help but question his own role in this twisted world. The subtle effects of his own splicing seemed like a betrayal now, a reminder of the darkness that lurked within them all. He had dedicated his life to protecting the citizens of New Citadel. But at what cost? Could he truly justify his actions when they led to such horrific outcomes? As the hours passed, Brant sat vigil by Thorne's side, his thoughts consumed by self-doubt and guilt. He had failed his friend, and the weight of that failure threatened to crush him. But beneath the sorrow and regret, a spark of determination still flickered. Brant knew that he couldn't change the past, but he could fight to prevent further suffering. He would honor Thorne's memory by bringing an end to the black market trade in genetic enhancements, no matter the cost. And he would save Lila Rhodes, the deadliest hybrid of them all, from the clutches of her own twisted nature. With renewed resolve, Amos Brant stood up, his intense blue eyes filled with purpose. He would face the darkness head-on, confronting the horrors of genetic splicing and the monsters it created. For the sake of his friend, for the sake of Lila, and for the sake of New Citadel, he would see this mission through to the end. Amos Brant stood before the remnants of his team, their faces etched with grief and steeled with resolve. The air in the dimly lit hideout hung heavy with the weight of their collective loss, a constant reminder of the price they had paid in their pursuit of justice. Sergeant Remy Thorne's sacrifice still loomed large, casting a somber pall over the gathering. Brant's eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on each member of his ragtag crew. He saw in their gazes a determination that mirrored his own, a burning desire to bring an end to the twisted machinations of Dr. Evelyn Rhodes and her monstrous creations. "We've come too far to turn back now," Brant began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We know what Rhodes is capable of, and we know what's at stake. We can't let Thorne's sacrifice be in vain." A murmur of assent rippled through the room, and Brant felt a swell of pride in his team's unwavering commitment. He continued, his words growing more forceful as he outlined their plan to infiltrate Rhodes's main lab and put an end to her dark experiments once and for all. As Brant spoke, he couldn't help but reflect on his own journey, the path that had led him to this moment. His thoughts drifted back to the first time he had encountered the fruits of Rhoda's twisted labor, the gruesome aftermath of a mutant attack that had left its victims barely recognizable as human. The memory still sent chills down his spine, a stark reminder of the horrors that genetic splicing could unleash when left unchecked. But it was his own spliced genes that truly haunted him, a constant reminder of his own complicity in this dark world. He had sought to enhance his abilities in order to better serve the citizens of New Citadel. But in doing so, he had also opened the door to the very darkness he now sought to vanquish. With a deep breath, Brant pushed aside his doubts and focused on the task at hand. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. He would see this mission through to the end, no matter the cost. As the team prepared for their final assault, Brant couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the resilience and bravery of the men and women who stood beside him. They were a motley crew, each with their own unique skills and motivations, but united in their determination to bring down Rhodes and her twisted empire. Nina Santos, the resourceful journalist who had risked everything to expose Rhodes's crimes, checked her weapons with a practiced efficiency. Her eyes were sharp, her focus unwavering, and Brant knew that she would stop at nothing to see justice done. Sergeant Remy Thorne's replacement, a young officer named Leighton, stood tall and proud, his spliced eagle genes lending him an air of predatory grace. He had been Thorne's protégé, and Brant could see the fierce determination in the young man's eyes as he vowed to honor his mentor's memory by bringing Rhodes to justice. Together, they would face the horrors that lay ahead, braving the unknown dangers that lurked within the walls of Rhodes's main lab. They would confront the monstrous creations that she had unleashed upon the world, and they would put an end to her twisted machinations once and for all. As the team moved out, Brant felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. He knew that the odds were stacked against them, that they were venturing into the heart of darkness itself. But he also knew that they were not alone. They had each other, and they had the unwavering conviction that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. Together, they would face the nightmare that was Dr. Evelyn Rhodes and her twisted creations. And together, they would find the strength to emerge victorious from the shadows, bringing light and hope to a world that had been plunged into darkness. As they approached the imposing gates of Rhodes's main lab, Brant felt his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins like liquid fire. He knew that there was no turning back now, that they were about to enter the belly of the beast. But he also knew that he was not alone. He had his team, his friends, and his unwavering conviction that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. Together, they would face the darkness and emerge victorious, bringing an end to the nightmare that was Dr. Evelyn Rhodes and her twisted creations. With a deep breath, Brant steeled himself for the battle that lay ahead. He knew that it would not be easy, that they would face unimaginable horrors and insurmountable odds. But he also knew that they would not falter, that they would stand together and fight until the very end. And so, with a fierce determination burning in his heart, Amos Brant led his team into the fray, ready to face whatever nightmares awaited them within the walls of Dr. Rhodes's main lab.